Yeah, my internet is really slowed down.
All right, so I can go ahead and share it then. So you probably noticed the internet at the quarantine hotel is not the best. So you might have to hotspot from your phone.
It's probably just that the hotel's full, right? And the bandwidth is stretched out. Yeah, Celine, what's going on?
For those of oh hi everybody. For those of you that are in your quarantine hotel and your internet is not great, especially if you're on the top floors, if you let them know, they might be able to provide you with like a little internet egg. I got one yesterday because my internet was going out like throughout the whole day. So I got a little egg that I can that's been working great. So if you can do that, Sean, I know you're if your internet keeps acting up, you can do that.
Yeah, we'll so get an internet egg. All right. Hopefully this works out okay. Everybody can see the screen. I lost a lot of views of the people, but hopefully you can see my screen. Yes, thanks, Danny. Okay. So Matt, you're the controls then, yeah?
I do my best.
Okay. Right. So Matt, Matt shared a little bit about his personal experience and feelings on CLIL. You probably know it by the acronym CBI as well, content-based instruction. And they're used interchangeably in some contexts, and in others, they'll only talk about CLIL. In others, they only talk about content-based instruction. So depends where you are. Here in Taiwan, we always hear the acronym CLIL, so that's what they're into. And in terms of definitions, should we head into the next slide? In terms of definitions, you'll hear a range of different things, and okay, we'll get into the agenda too. But in terms of definitions, I think one of the challenges with CLIL is that there are multiple definitions, and it's kind of a fluid new way of teaching. So there's a lot of disagreement on what exactly it is. It's a bit, like I said, fluid, a bit subjective. So we'll try to walk you through that and see and share with you the context here in Taiwan. I think we scratched the warm-up question, but in terms of agenda, because we have a lot going on in this slide, but in terms of agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about CLIL in Taiwan, talk about classroom English, what it is and why you should use it, and then we are going to watch a short clip of an ETF from, I believe, last year, doing some CLIL in a primary school. So probably no more than 10 minutes there, just to give you an idea. And we want to share a few case studies and get your insights on how you would handle a certain situation. And that will lead, hopefully, very well into some Q&A where we want to hear what your situation is. If you're having to teach any CLIL, or maybe you were, but you didn't really know that there's this name for it because there maybe were some communication issues. But we want to hear what it's like for you, and we want to hopefully help share some insights. So that's the agenda. We can go into a few quotes, I think, on CLIL, a few definitions. Right, we talked a little bit about CLIL in Taiwan, but things to remember, it's really a dual focus. So there's a language component, and then there is the material as well, right? The context. So it depends on your school, the other teachers, the administration, whether their angle is more on language or more on the material, whether it's biology or math or whatever type of theme course you're teaching, right? So there's a dual focus. It can shift one way or the other, or sometimes it's right in the middle. But the emphasis is typically on learning by doing, right? And you're trying to get students active and moving, and you want construction. creation rather than instruction, right? Rather than just telling them things or telling them what to do. And a big one, I think sometimes teachers get stuck on this whole, fluency debate. Should I be teaching for fluency? Should I be teaching for accuracy? Because students, just like any other human, they make mistakes, and we want to stress fluency rather than perfection, right? We have no expectation for students to be native speakers. They weren't born in the language, and for essentially all of them, it's their second or third. And I think once you get out into the provinces, it might, be their third language. It's a very foreign thing for them still. So we don't want to be preaching native speaking skills. Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up what Sean said. I think it's very important that CLIL is not about instruction, right? So a lot of times I observe a CLIL classroom and the teacher just goes into lecture mode. Oh, it's a subject area course. I'm just going to lecture at the students. So any TESOL principles that we've covered already are still going to apply in the CLIL classroom. And CLIL is actually under the communicative language teaching umbrella. So it's all about making the content interactive and giving communicative tasks and learning tasks to your students that kind of brings the subject alive. And as Sean mentioned, you have the dual prong or the dual forks, which is your language and content together. So don't think of CLIL as lecturing about the content. That is absolutely the opposite of what we want to do.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for sharing that. This is not limited to language, but you want to make functionally competent students, right? You don't want students that speak like robots. We don't want that. Even if they do speak perfectly, we want them to make mistakes sometimes, to learn from them, and to be active in their own learning. So TEDx and Camerata have a pretty straightforward quote for us. They say content is taught in the student's second language, their L2, could be an L3 actually, which they're still in the process of learning. So this is not a static thing. They are still, right, they're still learning the language as they learn a subject. It's not as if they have proficiency in English and then, okay, now they can learn English and biology. It's a dual focus, so they have these two things going on alongside. What's the next quote, Matt? Right, COIL talks about it as an approach and umbrella term. CLIL encompasses any activity in which, quote, a foreign language is used as a tool in the learning of a non-language subject in which both the language and the subject have a joint role. So this is pretty much what I talked about at the outset, right? There's a dual role. Ideally, one doesn't have precedent over another, but again, it will depend on your situation. All right, so what is bilingual education? Let's compare and contrast a little bit. How does it differ from traditional EFL education? Next slide, please. Awesome, right. So myself and a lot of other people of my generation kind of grew up in the ELT kind of column there, right? So in terms of learning aims, it's pretty straightforward. It's just the English language, right, for an ELT classroom. But in a bilingual classroom or a CLIL classroom, it's not just a language, but also the subject material. So for example, right, it could be biology, chemistry, algebra, whatnot, right? In terms of the profile of the teacher, obviously for someone that's teaching purely the language, we expect them to be fluent, not necessarily a native speaker, but having some background, some training, education in English language teaching, and ideally a certain amount of fluency. For the CLIL teacher, they, I think usually in your context are going to have expertise in another field, right? So something in the life sciences, geography, a specific subject. Proficient in English, that makes the most sense, right? But probably there will be varying degrees of proficiency in terms of your LET or your colleague. And this is where your expertise or your experience comes in, is that you have some background, hopefully, in ELT, and you can share some strategies about how to tackle co-teaching, how to tackle CLIL, right? So an example of a lesson difference would be for an ELT class, you know, one morning you're going to teach conditionals, right? Whereas with maybe a science class, that morning you're teaching photosynthesis, which is not to say you're not teaching the conditional sense. You could be teaching something grammar related, but it's embedded in the content, right? You're not talking about the conditional tense. You're talking about the process of photosynthesis, right? Materials, as you can imagine, for a language course, you know, you might have a big, thick textbook, grammar book. We know how those are structured. And obviously for a CLIL course, you know, there's the biology book. And of course, it's in English. It's in the target language. Finishing up in terms of the basis, right? It depends on the level of English and the types of skills students have. Whereas in a CBI or a CLIL course, ideally you are trying to go through some academic English. You have some standards, you know your students' aptitudes, and that corresponds to grades they get. And you're probably dealing with curriculum requirements that don't necessarily correlate to language teaching, the language teaching you're doing. Lastly, language skills. For the ELT courses, you're talking about hypotheticals, counterfactual things, right? You know, there's role-playing stuff. But for a CLIL course, you're doing experiments, you're putting specific vocabulary into usage, and you're actually engaging with content, like I said, with experiments or projects. You're not just you know, reading a dialogue or something like that, okay? So those are the big differences in comparing the two. Thank you. So how does Taiwan fit into this, right? It's 2021, right? Let me check. Yeah. So bilingual by 2030, this is very ambitious. I'm not sure when they started this goal, but it's very soon in terms of a really big bureaucracy, a big educational bureaucracy on an entire island of what, 24 million people. So it's a big goal, but it's realistic because of you know, the population isn't too huge. It's not as big as, for example, the United States, right? Okay, Matt, what's at the bottom? Right, how do we do that? Big question. There we go, yeah. Right, so we have this nice umbrella, and under the umbrella we have some ways to have bilingual education, right? So it's not just English or math, but you're combining art in English, or PE is taught in English, music, science, math. So all the basic subjects, right? So we have this quote from a Teaching English article, right? There's the goal again. The quote is, learning another content subject such as physics or geography through the medium of a foreign language, and learning a foreign language by studying a content-based subject. So this is what we've been talking about, but they are interlinked, and you're not just teaching math or English, it should be integrated. All right, so the next question, how do we implement CLIL courses in our schools around Taiwan? Right, so yeah, what is the rationale? Why does the Taiwanese government want to do this? Let's understand why. That'll help us out a lot. So they want to strengthen English proficiency in terms of helping out on the demand side, right? Companies, businesses need multilingual employees, people that obviously speak Chinese and speak local dialects, but also, of course, English. So it's related to student success after they leave school, right? Number two, reducing the rural-urban divide. This one is really not limited to Taiwan, as you can imagine. If we look at the US, for example, there's a huge rural-urban divide in a lot of ways, right? So we don't want that too much, because that means most likely that there's a big digital gap, and there's a lot of issues in terms of access to services, technology, education, infrastructure. So with bilingualism, it helps to bridge linguistic divides where typically people in rural areas don't have access to as many teachers, as many skilled teachers, and as much tech. So through having awesome teachers like you guys in different parts of the country, it helps to bridge that gap, and hopefully also to bridge that gap through the use of technology. Third, this is really great, and it's really great to see in Taiwan. They have a bilingual policy and a native language policy working together. So again, in rural areas, for example, in the South, maybe like Pingtung, and outside of Kaohsiung, once you go up into the mountains, you see probably more native language policy, and it's also given the respect it deserves alongside with the national language and English. Again, number four is like number one, forging competitive advantage for young people, giving them more chances to have better jobs inside and outside of Taiwan. So it wasn't going to be that easy, right? It has to be incentivized. So the central government has funds for this, and county governments can choose to apply or not to get access to these funds, that with the promise that they will distribute the money to schools in their districts to establish bilingual programs, right? So it has to be incentivized, right? Next slide. Yeah, so the schools do get the funding, and they are expected to start teaching different types of courses, for example, CLIL, but they're going to run into some problems because this isn't magic, right? Next slide. Right, there's a lot of buzzwords, but like I mentioned at the outset, no one is really sure what CLIL is. Even people that have strong opinions might come up against other people that have strong opinions. So it's the way it is. People have different ideas about how to approach it, how realistic it is in their school or in their school district. So we end up with CLIL classes that look very different, hard to compare. There's definitely a lack of uniformity. So even if we do have a lot of different CLIL classes out there, it can be hard to, for example, share material or create material that's going to satisfy everyone. Some known knowns, some known problems. Right, so I just touched on this, but because this is pretty new and pretty novel, there's no curricula coming hot off the press there's no universal curriculum for everybody to use, right? So there's inconsistency. There's a greater demand for you guys to create your content yourself and to share it amongst each other. So because the content is new and it's inconsistent, you can't have universal assessments. You also have to create your own assessments. which is okay. You know, there's a lot of way to assess students. I know a big one for teachers is just a lack of time. We all know that teachers are under a lot of stress and time constraints. So what they don't want is more hours to plan kind of in this unknown sphere of education that's very new. There's a lot of different ideas, and it's a stress on teachers. So it requires a lot of cooperation between the LET, between other local teachers, between content teachers and yourselves. Matt, I think there's one more bar. There we go. Right, so this is where we kind of come in, but there's a lack of training for CLIL. We're trying to get it out there more and more, but that's kind of what's feeding a lack of understanding on the topic. And obviously it's difficult to simplify subject materials enough to teach them in English because in my case, I was never a strong math or science student. I had to study really hard to be good at those. So yeah, when I think about studying that in another language like Spanish or something, it starts to be a little bit overwhelming because it might be too difficult. And then what do you do if your material is too high above the students, right? So it can be difficult to find a balance between content and language, as we're going to talk about in the case studies. You know, some teachers are going to want to focus more on the content, maybe just because they don't feel confident in their English. But you know, you have to kind of work with your co-teacher, with your LET, to figure out where you guys are going to find the balance on the spectrum, hopefully somewhere near the middle for both of your sakes. Right, a couple more problems, I think just a few more. But as I just mentioned, there's a lack of language proficiency sometimes from students. And I had an ETF email me recently talking about, yeah, so she has some students that can't keep up, while some students are way far ahead. So, you know, this is an issue in CLIL courses. It's an issue in regular courses as well that aren't CLIL. Yeah. So another great reason to do CLIL is it gives teachers and co-teachers great opportunities to collaborate and to improve their co-teaching skills, because a lot of them lack them. Maybe they weren't trained in it, or they taught at a school before that didn't have it. So like I said, CLIL has many models, but the bread and butter, probably the best one, is a co-teaching model, because there is so much weight on a teacher, right? There's so much content and so much expected from the administration. Lastly, I think, hopefully, there's a lack of data because it is pretty new. And we're not going to say Taiwan's a guinea pig, but they're really forging the way in terms of an ambitious approach to CLIL in classrooms in cities and rural areas, and trying to find proven ways for students to improve their English quickly over time. Oh, good, right? So are there any benefits to CLIL? Let's talk about those. Yeah, right. So I just mentioned this, but it facilitates collaboration between different teachers, between the content teacher, the language teacher, and it might not be immediately apparent, but you're going to learn from each other, maybe some hard ways and some easy ways, but you'll learn about different teaching styles, how to support another teacher, and how to allow yourself to be supported as well. I think that's something, it takes time to learn. You know, when a teacher is trying to help you, really allowing that in, accepting their criticism, accepting their advice, and processing it and letting that change you. This is really important for the students, but it provides a lot more diverse ways for them to learn, right? So Matt mentioned at the outset, being careful about, CLIL, okay, so I'm teaching biology and English, that means I'm doing CLIL, right? I'm just, because I'm talking to the students or I'm lecturing, but it should be very active, right? Remember, construction as opposed to instruction, and you can do this through reading and writing activities, through getting them moving around, doing experiments, group projects, interacting, just standing up and doing something helps a lot. Through listening and through visual means, our favorite. Yeah, so we want to lower students' anxiety, right? Lower their affective filter. And a great way to do that is through CLIL, because they are focused on the content and they're not being reminded, we're going to be talking about conditionals or we're going to be talking about the passive tense. It's less meta, right? It's less on the surface, and you're really in the content using, maybe a grammar construction in a lesson. Right, so CLIL programs are going to be more vibrant. Parents are going to like that. Students will probably learn to like that once they realize it's about more active learning and experiments and making things. Right. It's the most direct way to increase English exposure, right? Because students have a certain amount of themed lessons or classes throughout the day, right? Biology, math, this and that. So if the majority of that is in English, they're getting it on a lot of different fronts, not just during an hour English class or 40 minutes, right? So yeah, these are all the reasons. It's good for teachers. This is good for educators because they're broadening their skills. They're learning from each other. Hopefully there's some professional development where they're also learning. And it's an inclusive environment. Everybody is expected to get involved and to partake. And yeah, everybody learns new skills. And yes, many perspectives, a lot of perspective sharing. And we can think of language as its own, an individual language as its own perspective, right? We don't think of it like that often, but English or American English is actually a very specific worldview, right? And so the culture and the worldview informs the language and vice versa. So it's important to think about how sensitive these things are and the different perspectives we have control over. What's next? Yeah, so in summary, the good thing is that we're all in this together, right? We're all here. And this is a phenomenon not just happening in Taiwan, but in a lot of parts of the world that have ambitious and progressive educational policies. So yeah, this is why myself and the other advisors have a personal interest in this kind of thing, because it's going to be a really big part of education now and in the future. And it's pretty novel, right? You're a trailblazer. And it's new. You're not expected to be perfect, or there's going to be trial and error. But the idea is that you work with your team there in the classroom, talk with us, and we have professional development so we can all help each other. Yes, exactly. Everyone's experiences are going to look a little to a lot different, hard to compare, but we can still share and sometimes commiserate, right? Exactly, right? We're here and we care, and we want to help as much as we can. Okay, Matt, you ready for the baton?
Yes, so. So before I start, does anybody have any questions for Sean or any of the details that we've discussed so far?
How was my internet? Was it pretty good? Yeah? Okay.
I had no idea you're in a hotel. Celine, is there anything you would like to add to this discussion?
Sure. Just a brief comment on what Sean was saying about how you're not alone, right? And CLIL is new, so you're not expected to be experts. We're not experts. Nobody's an expert. Like, it's still developing, and so don't feel the pressure. For those of you who are in a CLIL environment, don't feel the pressure to know how to implement, all of your content and your language together, how to bring those together. It's, trial and error. We're of course here to help you with our experience. But please don't feel the pressure that, oh my God, it has to be perfect. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
All right. Yes. Thank you, Celine. And Emily, you have a comment or a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if there's any concern for like a decrease in the Taiwanese school children's like test scores in some of these like subjects. I know like we learned earlier today that Taiwanese students are really proficient in like the math and sciences worldwide. Like they're very competitive. And I was wondering if there's like any concern about those like skills decreasing using like a CLIL based model.
Yeah, Emily, that's an excellent question. And I think I'll let Kenny double check what I say so I don't give you wrong information. But I believe right now in this rollout of CLIL, they're starting with elective classes. So that's like your PE, your music, your art, your life sciences. And I believe these aren't tested with the standardized test subjects. So at this stage, they're trying not to worry about, oh, what if our test scores go down? So like the workaround is just to do elective classes. So if you're doing CLIL, usually it's PE, art, music, life science, or maybe some international cross-cultural class. Kenny, is that pretty much accurate?
Yeah, I think for CLIL, they are not focusing on the main subjects. So basically, they'll be focusing on life, music, art, PE, so that it will not really affect their future studies and also what kind of college or high schools they go to.
And then Emily, if once the rollout gets to their subject classes, I think you're going to have this conversation. With CLIL, you have the language and the content. But if you're testing on the content, maybe the content will take a higher priority in the CLIL class that are non-elective classes. So maybe in the elective classes, you can focus more on the language, and then the subject classes that are tested, maybe the content will take a higher priority. Yes, Danny.
Yeah, so if we're not teaching in CLIL classes, is there a few takeaways that we should be taking from CLIL to put into the English language learning?
That's a wonderful question, Danny. Sean, how would you answer that?
Yeah, good question. I mentioned that a little bit in my intro, but yeah, so CLIL is really useful because it's very interactive, right? So you want students learning through communicating with each other, not just through listening, through listening to the teacher. But as we'll get into a little bit more today, it's good for all teaching style, all types of courses, because yeah, it's focused, it's learner centered. You're trying to boost their communication from peer to peer and with you. So yeah, I think just anything we're going to cover here is going to be helpful for a teacher in 2021 because all this stuff's interconnected, right? CLIL uses tech, other teaching methodologies use tech. It's all linked together. So it might not feel directly involving you, but who knows, next semester or next year or 5 years down the line, you'll be interviewing for a job and say, oh, what do you know about CLIL? And you'll be like, oh, actually, and you'll remember all this stuff from a few years ago. So it might not feel immediately impactful, but yeah, CLIL definitely is trying to teach skills that we're trying to teach students in other types of classes as well.
Can I add to that?
Go for it.
So some of you, if CLIL is not your setting, you might still be able to do a few like incorporate like an art lesson into your class. I mean, it's something very small, but you're still teaching art, with English, or a little bit of science, or for those of you who like music, you can incorporate, some small music lessons in there. So even if you're not in a full CLIL setting, you can still incorporate those little things into your lessons here and there. Also, you could do, like, if you have extracurricular activities like an English club, you can have some of these lessons as well. So yeah, there's all kinds of ways that you can incorporate CLIL.
Great. And Alexia, you have a comment or a question?
Yeah, so this kind of builds on Emily's question a little bit. So I know you said that with the implementation of CLIL right now, they're mostly focusing on arts-based or extracurricular type things, music, the arts. So do you think that would, as they shift more towards using CLIL in more predominant classes, the math, sciences, and the such, do you think that would put more pressure on cram schools and I guess students themselves to kind of put more effort into cram school, since now there might be some deficits that come from trying to implement more of those CLIL standards in a regular school setting?
It's a very complex answer, but in short, I would say yes, definitely, Alexia. You're very intuitive on this. I think the benefit of lecturing a content course is that it's very good. It's the best way to get a student to have high test scores is to lecture about the content, right? So if you have a communicative class or if you have an output-based class, usually you'll see test scores fall, which can be very problematic for policymakers trying to evaluate the effectiveness of their education systems. So yeah, if CLIL goes to the content courses, the non-elective, I would think the scores would fall a bit, because the best way to teach traditional testing is through traditional methods. Like you look at the countries that score highest on any standardized test, and usually they're using the most traditional testing method. Rote memorizations. Just the teacher is talking and expects the students to memorize all the important figures and facts. But when you get to more modern teaching techniques, you usually see a little bit of fall in the test scores. But I think that's a separate debate, is how we evaluate our education systems and how effective standardized tests are. But there is, as it is now, I think policymakers and school officials, they look to the test scores, and if the test scores aren't high, they think that the schools and the teachers are failing, which I think is a wrong perspective, but I could definitely see that potentially happening. Does that answer your question?
It does, thank you.
But it's a very tough question to tackle. I don't know, Celine or Sean, do you have anything else to add on that? It's a very tough question.
Let's keep going so we don't run out of time.
Yeah, so usually, all right. So if you do find yourself in a CLIL classroom, I know a lot of people will be confused and maybe they don't know where exactly to start. So I'd recommend step one would be to start with classroom English. Oh, you're welcome. So start with classroom English. So the step one could just be, you greet the students in English, you ask them, how are you? Take out your textbooks, turn to page 25. Today we're going to talk about photosynthesis, right? And then that could just be your step one. Anytime you want a student response, raise your hand. So I think we can begin just with the basics of classroom English. So if your students are new to CLIL, if your co-teachers are new to CLIL, I don't think it's the best idea to just jump in and do the whole lesson in English or do a whole CLIL lesson all at once. So I like the gradual approach, kind of incrementalism, that by the end of the semester, we can get to about 60 to 70% of the class completely in English. But at the start, it's okay if it's 15 to 20%. All right, so what is classroom English? It's commonly used words, phrases, and expressions when teaching a lesson. So it doesn't have to be just in the English class. So we're going to look at classroom English versus content English. And using consistent classroom English is going to help your students follow along presented with new content. So this is kind of what Alexia was talking about, that the students are going to have two burdens now. They have the burden of language in the class, and they have the burden of content, which increases that cognitive burden on our students. One way to lower or lessen this burden of these two unknowns is just to use the same consistent and familiar classroom English. So here are some of the 20 most common classroom instructions. Take out a pen or a pencil, open your books, close your books, stand up, sit down, look at the board, look at the teacher, repeat after me, raise your hand, put your hand down. And I think this is important. For example, you might be paired with a co-teacher who is a content teacher. So they might not feel comfortable speaking English or comfortable doing CLIL subjects in English. So you can practice with them building routines with classroom English. So I think it's a great starting point for your LET, especially an LET who doesn't have the confidence or is not comfortable speaking English. Just go to step one. Let's work on implementing classroom English into our CLIL subjects. So for me, this is step one. And this is just my own informal steps. This isn't formal or endorsed by Fulbright yet. So let's go ahead and look at a dialogue. And I want you to think about what in this dialogue is classroom English and what is content English. So actually, almost all of this is classroom English, right? So the greetings, asking students, how are you? These are your consistent classroom routines. These are the consistent language you're going to use in every class. What's left is our content, right? Oops. So bananas, noodles, cheese, steak. These are our new vocabulary words. And this CLIL lesson would be maybe a PE class or life science class about food and eating healthy. So that's also related to Danny's question. So there will be some overlap with the subject matter. So if you're in an English classroom, you probably will also do a food lesson. If you're doing CLIL, you'll also probably do a food lesson as well. So what's the point here? You can see this classroom English should be very familiar with your students if you're using it every day. And again, this is going to lower that anxiety of your students because they have the dual burdens in the CLIL classrooms. And this goes to making our content more comprehensible. So I want you to think about We've discussed this, I think, in previous workshops. So this is a bit of a review, but if you could in the chat box, just write some ways we can make content more comprehensible to our language learners. So maybe take like 10 to 20 seconds, think about it, and then write some responses in the chat box. All right, already some excellent answers. Give everybody a few more seconds. Camille, would you like to explain your answer? Repeat it a few times and change the way you explain it if they don't understand.
Yeah, I think it's good to explain it a few times, like maybe once or twice, just the same way. And then some students still might not understand that because some vocab words might be tricking them up. So if you just reword it with the same like theme or concept, but use different words, it might help them.
Absolutely. So this goes, you're going to have that teacher's intuition, that teacher's sense to sense what your students are understanding and what they're not understanding. And if they don't understand you the first time, it's okay. Don't get frustrated, but just try to find a different solution. Sometimes we have to go to our students' level and then slowly raise them up. And this going to their level can actually, we can speak slower than we think is appropriate, and we can maybe repeat ourselves more times than we think is necessary. So your students, you know, in elementary schools especially, they might be at a lower proficiency level than you expect, right? So these are EFL students, they're not ESL students. So really have to do all the things that you guys mentioned. Pictures, visuals, real life examples. So these are amazing responses. Body language, gestures. Don't talk too fast. That's a big one. So you're gonna have to slow down your speech. And we call this elaborating input, right? That's our key word of the day, elaborating. We have to elaborate our input, our what we're saying as a teacher with gestures, visuals, repetition, slow down our pace. We can also add some rhythm to how we say things, because younger learners, they really respond to like rhythmic chants or rhythmic target structures. How about Jamie? You say make sure you teach all styles of learning, focus on sensory aspects of teaching. Would you like to explain that a bit?
Yeah, so I was like thinking there's some students who might be kinesthetic learners, so like focus on that and then make sure you have visuals and pictures for your visual learners. Speaking slower for your auditory learners, of course. And then for me, I like focusing on the senses, like taste, touch, smell, because I remember when I was younger, it helped me learn a little bit better when I was focusing on that. So that's what I was getting at, especially with CLIL.
Yeah, and excellent points, Jamie. And with CLIL, again, we have the additional burden on the students. Anytime you can add multi-sensory learning tasks, it's going to reduce that affective filter. And it's also, we remember things better when we stimulate more memories, right? So this is the multi-sensory learning. The more senses that we can stimulate in our lessons, your students are actually going to remember more. So if you close your eyes and you think of a vivid memory, right? You might hear rain falling, right? You might, I don't know, hear birds chirping. But the more senses that we stimulate, even with our memory, the more vivid it becomes, which is kind of interesting. Go Jamie, pro teacher. Yes. Jamie, you're a pro already. All right, let's keep going just for the sake of time. So you guys are all on point. You've hit all the key points here. Use visuals, realia, which are physical props, pictures, GIFs, drawings. Repeat yourself, speak clearly and slowly, but naturally. Ask comprehension check questions frequently. Don't just talk at your students, but always ask them some interactive questions as you go. Explain, practice the same thing in a variety of ways. And this could be, as Jamie was mentioning, just different learning styles. You could have art activities, a song, a music activity, kinesthetic activity, one with physical movements. Being redundant is okay. And I think this is a key point of CLIL that a lot of people forget. They want to go too fast through the textbook, or they want to cover as much content as possible. But one of the key points of CLIL is mastery of the content. It's when a student masters the content in a second language, they're subconsciously going to have learned and acquired the language necessary to master the content. So in CLIL classes, you should go very, very slow, because the slower you go, your students are developing this mastery of the subject material. And it's that mastery of the subject material that brings that language learning to life. And also, it's the language part can be a little bit subconscious, right? So you have to give them the right tools to understand the lesson, of course. So they're going to need appropriate language supports, but just enough. You don't want to over support them either, because we want the brain to, through context and experience and doing the learning tasks, to somehow subconsciously acquire the language. So in a way, you want them to get so involved in the content, get so involved in the task, that they forget they're learning English. So it's like I was playing a mobile game the other day, and I went on a walk. I was walking and playing my game, and I ended up walking for 5 hours. But I forgot I was exercising, right? At the end of the day, I had 30,000 steps. But I was so involved in my mobile game that I forgot I was exercising. And I think CLIL classes is the same way. You want the students to get so involved in the content, so involved in the task, that they forget that they're learning English. This is going to take a lot of modeling instructions as well. All right, so key principles to using classroom English: be intentional, use simple and clear English, take time to teach classroom English, and use high-frequency vocabulary words. Have priorities. So think about, is it ever okay to speak Chinese? What if you have emergency out-of-control situations? What are you going to do then? It probably will be necessary to use Chinese then. Develop routines. Try not to bite off more than you can chew. So take it slow. Come up with daily routines. And again, these routines are going to make the flow of your classroom familiar to your students, because they have those dual burdens with the CLIL classrooms. And because of this, those two burdens, we have to scaffold almost every part of the lesson. So model at first, give them a lot of supports. And a great way to scaffold is you go whole class response, group response, pair response, individual, and you can vary this between random volunteers and voluntary volunteers. All right, so we gave you step 1, which was developing classroom English routines. And again, these are just my informal steps that I came up with. Step 2, I think, would be to start every class with an English warm-up. And this warm-up should be related to the content of the day. And this is what we call activating the schema. So the schema is that background knowledge. When you activate the schema, it allows for the brain to easily process new information. The brain knows where to put the new information and how to categorize it in the brain. Step 3, once you get step 1 and 2 down, which is start pre-teaching the vocabulary in English, the content-specific vocabularies. Step 4 could be you can deliver the content in the L1 in Mandarin, but assess the content in English. And then step 5, the learning task could be done in English and also assess the content in English. So hopefully by the end of these 5 steps, you will have a classroom maybe 60 to 70% in English by the end of the semester. But it's important, if you start trying to do all 5 steps at once, it might be very frustrating for your students and your LET. It just might be an overall bad experience. So I would always have the end goal in mind, that is by the end of the semester, you want to get to build up to these 5 steps. And just you're going to have to use, again, your teacher's intuition, your teacher's sense, to know when it's the right time to include additional steps in your classroom. So it's going to be different for every step, every class, when your students can handle these additional steps. But I think this gradual approach is more appropriate in the CLIL classroom. And then some lesson planning tips for CLIL is your objectives. So make sure you know what your content objectives are, and make sure you know what your language objectives are. So this is the dual prong or dual fork you have in the class. You need language objectives and content objectives. Then how are you going to assess that the learning objectives have been met? Sequencing your lesson is very important. So proceed from simple to complex. This goes back to our steps 1 through 5 as well. So start at step 1 and then slowly try to add additional steps in your classroom. So simple to complex can be as simple as starting with a warm-up and then finishing with a more complex production task or learning task. And as much as you can, recycle old material. Distributed practice is much more effective than mass practice. Recycling material can also involve what are they learning in their English class, and how can I transfer their current unit and vocabulary from their English classroom to the CLIL classroom. So there should be some overlap and synchronicity with their English classroom as well. Chunking is very important to avoid this cognitive overload, especially in CLIL. There's a very high cognitive demand with the language and the content. And it's interesting, the short-term memory only holds 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information. So this is why I think credit cards are 12 numbers long, and phone numbers are usually 9 or 10 numbers, right? So what does this mean for your CLIL classroom? Your vocabulary, right? So don't try to teach 12 vocabulary words. So don't do too much. An appropriate number of vocabulary words is 7 plus or minus 2, right? So usually 6 to 8 is a good number. The long-term memory, it's also interesting, has a write time parameter of 1 minute. So take your time. What this means is short-term memory has to hold the information for at least 1 minute in a meaningful way for it to transfer to long-term memory. So if we're just presenting vocabulary words for 15 seconds, right, it's not going to transfer to long-term memory. We have to practice each vocabulary word at least 1 minute in a meaningful way for this long-term memory transfer to occur. Learning tasks. So learning tasks are another way to reduce the cognitive demand of students in the CLIL classroom because it makes the learning hands-on. So try to have a hands-on learning task for your content. And this task can be interactive, experiential. If it's a science class, it could be you're doing experiments. And these tasks should get students talking. So ideally, in a communicative classroom, students are talking 80% of the time. Teacher talk time is only supposed to be 20%. This is a communicative language classroom. So usually it's flipped, for better or for worse. And my last tip for lesson planning, always end on a high note. So you could have, I had some lessons, like the first 30 minutes, I'll be honest, weren't very good. But I had a solid final activity, and that's what students are going to remember, right? So do your best to have a really solid production activity at the end of the class, because this is going to get your students excited to come to their next class. Remember, part of this is getting our students excited to become lifelong English learners. So before we do our discussion, I'll just briefly talk about learning in memory, especially in relation to CLIL and content. So we talked about attention. So new information needs to be held for 1 minute in short-term or working memory to transfer to long-term memory. Chunking, we discussed this. Short-term memory only holds 7 plus or 2 bits of information. So don't overload students with too much information, but don't hold back either, right? So if we're not challenging our students, they also become disengaged. So you have to find that golden mean between overloading and underloading students. Talked about distributed practice, so make sure you're recycling previously learned materials, especially in the CLIL setting. Try to integrate as many vocabulary and unit topics and target structures from their current English class. Recency and primacy effects, kind of interesting quirk of memory. We tend to remember the beginning and end of a lesson the most. What's in the middle of a lesson or a workshop, we tend to forget. So you can put your most important things in the lesson at the beginning and the end. What you want your students to remember should kind of have a bookend approach. Recency effect is also if you learn somebody's name wrong the first time, that's why you always remember the name wrong. This is the recency effect. Sorry, the primacy effect. What you learn a thing the first time is how you remember it the most. Meaningful connections. This goes to our experiential learning. We remember most when we make meaningful connections to new information. So how can you connect the content to your students' fields of experience, your students' interests, and your students' context? So the more creativity, variation, suspense, meaningful content, and authentic contents you can integrate in your classroom, you're really going to stimulate these meaningful connections, which is how we remember things. Automaticity, skills become automatic through repetition, but repetition becomes monotonous and boring. So I think drilling is okay because this is how we can store things in long-term memory. But we have to be creative. We have to bring our drills to life. Don't just drill your students, but do it in a fun way. Gamify even the drills. So we can make practicing materials, even if you're practicing something 10 times or more, the students are going to have a lot of fun doing it. If you can gamify it in some way, or you can add some variation that makes it more exciting. Multimodality, this goes to our multi-sensory learning. The more senses stimulated while learning a new information, the stronger the memory is. Likewise, the more dynamic the information is processed, the deeper the depth of processing and the stronger the memory as well. So experiment with different methods, techniques, and activities. Learn how your students learn best, and learn what experiences really provoke their learning. Recall, students need to practice retrieving information from long-term memory. So provide students with plenty of production activities to increase the accessibility of knowledge. So just because something's in our long-term memory doesn't mean we can retrieve it. So when we can't, this is called retrieval failure, and information can actually get trapped in your long-term memory. So the more practice we have retrieving this information, using the vocabulary, using the target structures, the more readily accessible the students can produce the language. So in summary, in CLIL situations, the content teacher is the language teacher, and the language teacher is the content teacher. Include both language objectives and content objectives. Pre-teach specific vocabulary together with general English vocabulary. Use learning tasks to get students talking about the content, and these learning tasks will also reduce that cognitive demand, that high cognitive demand in our CLIL classroom. Take advantage of OERs. OERs are online educational resources. We'll have some links at the end of these slides. And then increase motivation by contextualizing content. So we need to contextualize the content to make it interesting to our students' experiences, our students' lives and interests and hobbies, so that they can connect with the material. So if they can't connect with the material, they become disengaged and have no learner buy-in or no incentive to learn about the material. All right, so before we go on, are there any questions or comments so far on CLIL and learning, memory, or anything at all? Sean, how are we doing on time?
I think we're running a little behind, so why don't we give them a break and then we'll bounce back and go through the rest pretty efficiently. What do you think? Okay,
Sounds good.
let's take 10, so we'll come back at 26 after. Kenny, are you there? You're there. So Matt, what do you think about breakout groups of like 4? We have about 40 people. Well, actually a little less. But like 4 people per group to give each of them a chance to talk. Like 10 groups.
Yeah, that works. So we feel like we talk too much at you, so we want to give you the last 35 minutes to discuss the CLIL situations and some case studies in small breakout groups. Yeah.
And we can let them choose which case study. There's 3 options, so we'll just let each group choose. So Kenny, if you could make 10 groups. Right, so these are the case studies, but I'm gonna go ahead and put the link in the chat so you guys can have it open. Oh, let's get back to that question in a minute. Right, so you can go ahead and open the link and you can have it to look at while you're also looking at the slides if you need to.
Let me wait me for a sec for the breakout rooms.
What was that, Kenny?
I say, give me a sec for the breakout rooms.
Sure, sure, sure.
Hey, Sean. Is there did you give access to the full, like, because I can't access. Right, okay.
Oh my gosh.
So make it public, please.
And then while we wait on that, I think Katie brought up a great question. And I would agree with you, Katie. Yeah, I think it's more important to focus on high frequency vocabulary words and kind of conversational English, and the really domain specific like mitochondria. I don't think it's that practical for our students, especially elementary school students. So they can say mitochondria, but they can't introduce themselves. It seems a little backwards to me. So again, I would go to their level. If they're ever ready, if they're ready for, the really domain specific vocabulary, sure, teach that. But if not, if they're still working on the basics, just high frequency vocabulary, general English, whatever you think is going to make, in the long term, they're the most effective English language speakers. But in general, I would absolutely agree with you. If you get too technical, they're going to lose interest, they're going to be frustrated, and has no real practical value, I think.
My bad. Matt, so how are we going to share this document with them if they don't have a full
Sorry, I think it's fine if they don't have a Fulbright, because I was able to access it through my personal Gmail. So
okay.
Try it, guys. It should be available. Oh, really? Not even Gmail?
So if you go to your like 3 dots and then you like open like the link accessibility and you change it to everyone can view who has the link, as long as you're okay with that, then I think you can change it.
Is that for me?
And mine's working now.
Yeah, it seems like it's working now. So, cool.
Okay.
I got your back, Sean. Don't worry. Yeah, so go ahead and read through the case studies, and you will be broken up into breakout groups. Your group can discuss whatever case study you want, and then we'll regroup in, say, 10 minutes, Sean? How long should they get to discuss?
I'd say like 7 or 8 is enough. They're really short case studies, right?
Okay, great. So maybe 7 minutes to talk about it in the group. Think about what would you do in the situation? What steps could you take to improve it? What would you hope your co-teacher would do differently? And how would you approach and bring it up with them?
Do people see the document now? I only see Carrie and Celine.
Yeah, I think the second link works for them.
Okay. All right, Kenny. Break us up.
Okay, so I just found out that I don't have the breakout rooms option. So maybe I'm still finding out who's the host. So one more sec.
Must be Kevy.
And I think these are all very common CLIL situations that you will find. So the more that we can take preventative measures and think in advance how we would tackle these common issues, the better. And while we wait for this breakout room, does anybody have any questions or comments so far? Do you like CLIL? Do you not like CLIL? Yes, Lexi.
I just wanted to clarify that in the case studies, the like names, are those people ETAs? Like those would be like us. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the names are the ETAs. So Susie, Billy, and Larry are the ETAs.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so it seems like I cannot find who's the host. So can everyone join this link and then we can have the breakout rooms?